Good afternoon. I'm Veronika Füchtner. I'm one of the co-directors of this Humanities Institute towards a global history of sexual science, together with Doug Haynes. I'm actually very, very pleased to introduce you today to Jill Smith. She's an associate professor and the chair of the German department at Bowdoin College. She has previously taught at Union College and received her PhD from Indiana University. Her dissertation won the Women in German Dissertation Prize, and her innovative dissertation research is the basis of her forthcoming book, Berlin Coquette, Prostitution, New Womanhood, and Desire in the German Capital. It's coming out with Cornell University Press this winter. In this book, Jill describes how the city of Berlin came to be known as the whore of Babylon, and how the discourses around prostitution in the city of Berlin transcended the usual cliches and came to explore complex visions of alternative moralities and of sexual countercultures. So we're all looking forward to seeing the book this winter. Jill has also published on many other aspects of 19th and 20th century German language culture, especially on film. And I wanted to emphasize here her work on Richard Oswald and the social hygiene film, also titled Promoting Health or Promiscuity. She teaches such classes that are titled Berlin, Sin City, Divided City, City of the Future, or Robots, Vamps, and Whores, which give me real course envy, and have ensured her a loyal following at Bowdoin. Jill is the recipient of several awards, including a Fulbright and the 2010 Sidney Karofsky Prize. Jill's work combines extensive archival research with very careful and original readings. And for this talk, I understand she worked in the archives of the Kinsey Institute, and we look very much forward to hearing the results today. Please help me welcome Jill Smith. So first of all, my warmest thanks to Doug Haynes and Veronika Füchtner for organizing this wonderful seminar and inviting me to participate. And to Isabel, even though she's not here, for arranging travel and accommodations and for being very patient with a recently tenured faculty member who didn't always want to answer emails as promptly as I usually do. And just one correction, my Kinsey years were actually when I was in graduate school at Indiana, when I had a lot of access to the Kinsey Institute and to the vast German language holdings there, including many of Hirschfeld's books. But I actually went to the Häberle archive in Berlin for my research for this particular piece. But in the Kinsey Institute, when I was doing research for my dissertation, I certainly encountered Levy-Lenz for the first time, so we'll talk about that. Good, so I'm actually going to begin my talk with a discussion of what it's like to enter the archives with a new project. I first encountered the writings of Ludwig Levy-Lenz when I was doing research on sexological discourses on prostitution in Berlin during the Weimar Republic. I found his contributions to Magnus Hirschfeld's multi-volume moral histories of both the First World War and the interwar period, as well as his essays in the periodical Die Ehe, or Marriage, to be complex and refreshingly non-judgmental in their perspectives on prostitution and venereal disease. Until I began the research for this talk, however, I had not studied Levy-Lenz's life and career beyond Weimar Berlin, nor had I seriously considered his multiple roles at the Institute of Sexual Science, where he worked from 1925 until 1933 as a relationship counselor, a sex educator, a gynecologist, and a surgeon who supposedly performed some of the first sexual reassignment operations in history. The very first document I found, so on the top of the stack, so those of you who do archival research will know what I'm talking about. You sit there in the archives, a librarian helps you out, you get a stack of folders, you open the first folder, and what do you find? So this is what I found when I opened that first folder in the Häberle Sexology archive at the Humboldt University in Berlin. And that was a 1978 article in Aufbau, the newspaper that has served the German Jewish exile community since 1934. The author of the article begins his story at a fashionable party in a luxury Egyptian villa with a view of the Giza pyramids, where he is suddenly struck by a large-scale graffito on the wall. So really carved into the wall of the villa is an image of Heidelberg, Germany's oldest university town,
where Levy-Lenz studied internal medicine, gynecology, psychiatry, and surgery before the First World War. And there are documents in the archives that also show what his specializations were in Heidelberg, and that he was magna cum laude, etc. Dubbed the Lenzburg, this villa was Levy-Lenz's second residence. The other was an apartment in downtown Cairo, adjacent to the doctor's successful cosmetic surgery practice, the Clinique de Berlin. So here's a headshot of Levy-Lenz with his years. So he did, there has been some confusion. If you look on the web, you'll sometimes see he died in 76, but I did find announcements, his death announcements from 66, so 1889 to 1966. And here, as you've probably seen on the poster, also the door plate for his clinic, and then written in Arabic below. So he ran this practice from 1937. Some of his first patients were in 1937 until his death in 1966, with some interruptions in the 40s, of course, due to the war. In typical journalistic fashion, the Aufbau article describes Levy-Lenz as, quote, cosmetic surgeon and sex doctor #1 in Berlin and Vienna, Paris and Munich between the world wars, end quote. It's a bit misleading, actually, considering that he did not begin performing cosmetic surgeries on a regular basis until the end of the Weimar period. And as far as sex doctors go, he was probably less well known than Hirschfeld or van de Velde. I think you've been reading, he was at least on the list. But he did probably have a bit more in common with van de Velde. He certainly advocated similar techniques as van de Velde did in terms of how to achieve female orgasm. So he's, and Atina Grossman takes him to task for this in Reforming Sex, for those of you who know that book. But back to the Aufbau article. According to Hansi Stross, a Jewish woman who fled Austria in the 1930s and still resided in Egypt at the time of the article's publication, Levy-Lenz and his wife Mary were generous and hospitable, and the doctor had very skilled hands. And I love this, I just had to include this because she waxes. Only a surgeon could make gefilte fish like he did. But on a more serious note, the Lenzes protected members of the Jewish community by providing space in their villa to those targeted during the Suez Crisis in the mid-1950s and the growing anti-Semitism under the Nasser regime in the 1960s. Germanness, Jewishness, exile, sexology, cosmetic surgery. How do these aspects of Levy-Lenz's life and career connect, and how and where do they disconnect? How has Levy-Lenz been positioned by scholars of sexology and cosmetic surgery in the last several decades? And how did he position himself in regard to issues of race, gender, and sexuality in his Memoirs of a Sexologist, Discretion and Indiscretion, published in 1951 in English and several years later in German? So those are some of the major questions I'll be asking in this paper. And I would say discretion and indiscretion, he's actually not very discreet. He's mostly rather indiscreet. And we'll talk about a little bit of that. The memoirs, which serve as the focus of my talk, are a curious mix of autobiographical narrative, sexological case studies, really examples of patients that he's had or supposedly had and treated, advice and information on a variety of health issues, sexual proclivities, and social phenomena. And really everything you might expect and more is in there: prostitution, homosexuality, abortion rights, tips for avoiding marital boredom, cocaine, we could talk about those, cocaine and morphine addiction, and how to expose a charlatan, you name it, it's all in there. Written in the early 1940s in Cairo, Levy-Lenz's memoirs are as much a document of exile as they are a nostalgic look back at Wilhelmine Germany and Weimar Berlin. The inscription at the end of the book's introduction reads, quote, written in Egypt in the winter of our distress, 1941, revised at happier times, 1949, end quote, reminding readers of the traumatic ruptures of the Second World War and the National Socialists' external imposition of a Jewish racial identity upon European Jews who had vastly different perspectives on Judaism and Jewishness. And when I say on Judaism and Jewishness, obviously I'm talking about religious versus cultural definitions of being Jewish, or in the case of Levy-Lenz, he did not invest much time in talking about Jewish identity at all. So although Levy-Lenz's Jewishness may have been the primary reason for his exile, The secondary reason being his work at Hirschfeld's Institute, of course, which might have been enough. It is not the main lens through which he viewed his past or his present. So one might think when one reads this Aufbau article as the first document, which does present him really as a good Jew. He makes good gefilte Fisch. He helps out. He's a member of the community in exile in Egypt. But I'm going to talk about how that Jewish identity has figured in some of the scholarship since Levy-Lenz's death, and why that might be problematic, and then how he actually talks about race, not necessarily about Jewishness, but about race in general. So in the memoir, he defines himself first and foremost, as we can tell by the title, as a sexologist, which in his mind is synonymous with being both a medical professional and a secular humanitarian. In this regard, he claims again and again to have drawn inspiration from Magnus Hirschfeld, who is honored in the memoirs as the ultimate humanitarian. It was clear to me as a reader of Levy-Lenz's memoirs that one of his main aims was to tell the story of the Institute of Sexual Science and its mission of scientific and humanitarian enlightenment, to ensure that after Hirschfeld's death and the Institute's destruction, this mission did not fade into obscurity. And in my mind, Levy-Lenz does serve as a sort of bridge between Hirschfeld and what Funke and Fischer called the second generation of European sexologists in their keynote, which I followed on Blackboard. And Kinsey, for Levy-Lenz's memoirs, were published in the US right between the two Kinsey reports, with a new edition, the one you see on the slide, available just after the 1953 report on sexual behavior in the human female came out. Now, the German version of the memoirs are a German version. They're not a one-to-one translation, which I find actually quite interesting and will figure also into my talk. The German version doesn't even mention Kinsey at all, but rather markets Levy-Lenz in the following way. Quote, his expert hand led him at the beginning of the 1930s into the field of plastic and cosmetic surgery, and today he's the, and this is a quote by Levy-Lenz himself, the magician of the fashionable world, end quote. He lives in both Cairo and Baden-Baden and is, now more than ever since the deaths of Hirschfeld, Moll, and Forel, the great oracle to whom people look for help and advice. And that's the end quote of the book marketing literature, of course. And I'll return to the issue of cosmetic surgery in a major way in a moment. So second of all, and this is a related point, Levy-Lenz sees himself as a Berliner, or at least someone who carries the responsibility of furthering the early 20th century work done in Berlin, no matter what his place of residence. And I know, again, from watching and listening to some of your discussions that you've been talking about the directionality of ideas. So what is the direction of flow of ideas about sexual science, and whether or not this flow is unidirectional. And of course, for those who resided in Europe and left, like Levy-Lenz, he does, I would say it's quite obvious that yes, he sees it as unidirectional and coming from himself and from the Institute for the most part. In fact, he says, those who worked at the Institute of Sexual Science, quote, monopolized the sphere of love, end quote, and by love he means the field of sexuality. Hence, we have the Clinique de Berlin in Cairo. But the existence of the Clinique de Berlin and its area of specialization, cosmetic surgery, raises the central questions of my talk. Why might cosmetic surgery be the logical extension of the work Levy-Lenz did in Weimar Berlin? What do sexology and cosmetic surgery have in common? Might we even see cosmetic surgery as, to loosely quote Chris Waters' brief essay on sexology, which you all read at the outside of the summer seminar, one of the channels through which sexological ideas have been disseminated in society, informing popular beliefs? So there's the full quote from Chris Waters' essay. So, the Clinique de Berlin, on the connections between sexology and cosmetic surgery. Let me start with two very clear connections between sexology and cosmetic surgery, as evidenced in Levy-Lenz's own career. And the first is his performance of sexual reassignment surgery, a practice that he continued to perform sporadically throughout his career, or, and I'm qualifying this, at least that's what I could glean from the scant resources available, some of which are rather unreliable web sources about transsexuals who allegedly were operated on by Levy-Lenz in Cairo. So I can talk about that a bit more in the Q&A if you're interested. But in his memoirs, Levy-Lenz describes sexual reassignment surgery as his first foray into cosmetic surgery. And this will be a very important quote for the entire paper. My first aesthetic operations, curiously enough, were genital operations. As surgeon of the Institute, I was able to find a quite satisfactory solution to the problem of creating an artificial vagina and artificial lips of the vulva. The first case of this kind was given full publicity in the international press. So far as the Institute was concerned, the result of this was that we received dozens of letters from all parts of the world, that lots of people came to see us to have the same or similar operation performed on themselves, and that I almost became a specialist in plastic genital operations. A strange calling indeed. But then these people came with other demands. A man wanted his features to appear more feminine. He required them to be toned down, to eliminate growth of hair on the face, wanted a smaller nose, narrower lips. Women who wanted to look like a man desired, on the contrary, to have a big nose, harder features, a wider chin. In short, I had a great deal of material on which to experiment, for I cannot call my first operations of this kind by any other name. It may seem odd to us today to categorize sex change operations as cosmetic surgery, especially considering the large role that hormone therapy has come to play in these procedures. And yet, as Rainer Herrn notes in his own groundbreaking study of transvestitism, transsexuality, and the first sexual reassignment surgeries performed at the Institute for Sexual Science, this is how such operations, aside from the procedure of castration, were categorized as cosmetic, by both medical professionals and by the Weimar legal system. Herrn also cites similar quotes from Levy-Lenz's memoirs in German, and in one of them the doctor is more forthcoming in his definition of these operations as experiments that did not always go well. So for the German speakers in the audience, he uses the phrase nicht immer schön geraten, which of course means not go well, but with the word schön in there, of course, we can talk about they did not end beautifully, or we'll talk about beauty. In terms of the operations receiving full publicity in the international press, as he contends in this quote, there is actually, and Rainer does talk about this as well, there's little to no evidence left of these operations, even in the medical literature. And Levy-Lenz's contention that they performed operations, therefore, on lots of people might be rather misleading, and there's even reason to question whether or not he did perform these things himself. Before I return to this particular quote and examine the doctor-patient relationship, as well as the gender dynamics at work in it in greater depth, let me provide you with a second concrete example of how Levy-Lenz linked sexology and cosmetic medicine in his own work, this time much later in his career. In 1952, he founded the German language journal published in Berlin called, this is my translation, Journal for Medical Cosmetics and Sexology. And this he served as the journal's editor-in-chief. The journal's main purpose, according to the back cover of the first issue, was, quote, to help preserve natural beauty and to delay the physical signs of aging as much as possible, end quote. Here we see how sexology and cosmetic procedures can be connected via the skin, and by that I mean via dermatological health. So when one flips through this journal, one sees a fair amount of tips about keeping healthy skin, how to prevent, of course, venereal disease. So the skin, we see this shift from sexology's, or we see this connection that sexology has probably always had with dermatology and dermatological afflictions. So think of the historical connection between dermatology, sexology, and venereal disease. And of course, there's also the connection to cultural ideas of youth and beauty, which are generally understood as essential elements of sexual attraction. Incidentally, the term sexology was dropped from the title of the journal by the following year. So this was an attempt to connect these two things that didn't really go well. It wasn't deemed marketable. And by 1960, the journal was called, quite simply, Aesthetic Medicine. Historically and spatially speaking, sexual science and cosmetic surgery have close ties to the city of Berlin. So the Klinik de Berlin does make sense in quite a few ways. And they owe their rise in prominence in great part to the ruptures of the First World War. As Sander Gilman has emphasized in his cultural history of aesthetic surgery, Making the Body Beautiful, Berlin became known as a center for innovation in cosmetic and plastic surgery through the work of Jacques Joseph, the father of modern rhinoplasty, who was actually dubbed as Nasen-Joseph, or Joseph of the Nose, who worked at the Charité Hospital in the center of the German capital. Joseph, along with the Parisian and rare woman surgeon Suzanne Noël, were mentors of Levy-Lenz in the field of plastic surgery. Plastic surgery, which Levy-Lenz reminds us in a later essay from 1960 on the subject of Schönheitschirurgie, or cosmetic surgery, he takes great pains to remind his readers that plastic surgery and cosmetic surgery are different fields. They're not to be conflated. And so I find it particularly interesting that in Gilman's book, he speaks about the rise of plastic surgery and the legitimacy of plastic surgery as being due to the masculinization of that discipline through the operations that were performed on war veterans. So plastic surgery became a legitimate medical pursuit immediately after the First World War, when medical technologies were developed to restore the faces, limbs, and sometimes the genitals of severely wounded veterans. Whereas cosmetic surgery is probably more linked to the feminine, so we'll talk about that. On a broader, more philosophical level, and we can see this, or it's at least hinted at, we can get to it through this longer quote from Levy-Lenz's Memoirs, sexology and cosmetic surgery serve as windows into both the oppressive and emancipatory elements of modernity, specifically modern sexual science or modern science in general, and into tensions between conformity and autonomy, the mass, and the individual. As Rainer Herrn so perceptively wonders in his study, and I wondered myself while doing the research for this project, what role does patient agency play in surgical procedures such as the first sex change operations? Who is the driving force between this type of physical modification, this medical experimentation? The surgeon who wishes to experiment, or the patient who wishes to bring his or her physical self into harmony with a perceived inner self that identifies with the opposite sex? What is the desired physical ideal to be achieved by surgery, and who or what processes generate this ideal? Does the desired physical outcome undermine or reify traditional notions of sex and gender? The more I read about both sexology and cosmetic surgery, the more I see how both disciplines or practices inextricably tie the physical to the psychic, the body to the self, proposing ways in which the two can be reconciled with one another or harmonized. Sexual reassignment surgery, which was viewed as a branch of sexology or viewed as coming under the umbrella of sexology for most of the 20th century, and cosmetic surgery, for instance, both rely on the patient and the doctor's ability to envision a more authentic self just waiting to be visualized, and then realized through a process of physical destruction and construction. So the cut, or what's become known in our culture as the nip tuck. Both thrive on the promise that a physical transformation can bring us into harmony with ourselves and thus improve our psychic states, make us happy, better people. But does the primary drive for self-improvement, harmony between body and self, come from within or from the external world, or from a mixture of both? And if it comes from without, what images provide the blueprint for change, and who provides these images? So before I provide my own answers to some of these questions, and my own answers have a lot to do with gender, let us look at how Sander Gilman has used Levy-Lenz's Memoirs to draw conclusions about cosmetic surgery and race. So part 3 of my talk is a detour, it's not a short detour, into Gilman's portrait of Levy-Lenz. And I mentioned this to Veronica last night, but let me start by saying that I do adore Sander Gilman and his work, and he's one of the reasons I went to graduate school in German studies and focused on Jewish studies. I know that he's a mentor, friend, and colleague to quite a few people in this room, but let me say with all respect due, that he sometimes does play it a bit fast and loose with his use and interpretation of sources, and that identifying misogyny in those sources is not always one of his strengths. So this is certainly the case in his brief portrait of Levy-Lenz, which he uses to support the core thesis of his book on aesthetic surgery. And that is, when I say aesthetic surgery, that is the preferred term that Gilman uses. So his main thesis, Gilman's main thesis, is, of course, that for those of you who know the book, you'll know this, that aesthetic surgery is a means toward passing. It helps patients conform to acceptable racial norms and to eliminate traces of unacceptable, stereotypical racial characteristics. Gender, although mentioned and, of course, entwined with race in Gilman's analysis, is generally an afterthought or a distraction from his main argument and is treated as such. And Suzanne Fraser's recent book called Cosmetic Surgery, Gender and Culture takes Gilman to task for this, so I'm certainly not the first person to make this point. Fixated on the marginal identities of practitioners of cosmetic surgery, Gilman hypothesizes that the motivation of the surgeon is the same as the patient's. It all comes down to passing. Quote, "They were colonials or Jews or people of mixed race or women for whom the problem of passing was and remained a central feature in their psychic lives," end quote, from Gilman. Citing two disparate sources, one the memoirs of a Hungarian Jewish cosmetic surgeon who survived the Second World War and Nazi persecution, and the other, the contemporary autobiography of a successful American Jewish cosmetic surgeon, Gilman portrays all Jewish cosmetic surgeons as racialized others who sense, quote, their own racial visibility, end quote, and fear that visibility. And then he doubles back to interwar Germany and ostensibly to figures like Jacques Joseph and Levy-Lenz to contend that, quote, the marginality of the aesthetic surgeon is most evident in the world of Weimar Germany, end quote. There is absolutely no indication in Levy-Lenz's memoirs, however, that he felt overly visible or imperiled as a German Jew living in Weimar Berlin, nor is there evidence, and this is more important, I think, to support the claim that Levy-Lenz performed surgeries on patients who wanted to racially pass. Instead of using Levy-Lenz's memoirs in English as his source, which you'll recall were published first, with the German version constituting not a straight translation but an adaptation, Gilman chooses passages from the German version and then translates those in his book. So actually using the same quotes that Reiner cites in his book that only roughly correspond with the longer quote here, Gilman muddles issues of gender and sexuality with those of race. So here's an example. When a patient of Levy-Lenz's complains that even though he has undergone genital surgery to become female, she still has a man's nose. So that man's nose is a quote from the Levy-Lenz German version of the memoir. I know this might be getting very confusing. But Gilman contends that, quote, Jewishness is what being marked with a male nose comes to mean in such circumstances, end quote. If we look at the corresponding quote in the English version of the memoirs, however, we see very clearly gendered images rather than racialized ones. So within the quote, a man wanted his features to appear more feminine. He required them to be toned down to eliminate growth of hair on the face, wanted a smaller nose, narrower lips. Women who wanted to look like a man desired, on the contrary, to have a big nose, harder features, a wider chin, so that's all in there. So if we were to actually follow Gilman's logic in our interpretation of this quote, then we would actually have to conclude that these women wanted to look like Jewish men because they wanted a bigger nose. I mean, it's sometimes actually a little bit absurd. It is therefore seemingly unfounded to claim, as Gilman does at the end of his brief portrait of Levy-Lenz, that, quote, racial biology and the alteration of constitution must be understood as a rationale for aesthetic surgery in Weimar Germany, end quote, and to use Levy-Lenz's memoirs as supporting this claim. In sum, I have two major issues with Gilman's portrait of Levy-Lenz. One involves the lack of historical specificity of the argument, while the other involves the centrality of race. With regard to history, as I mentioned earlier in my talk, it's problematic to read Levy-Lenz's memoirs as representing the view from within Weimar Germany, which is how Gilman exclusively presents it. It is the view also from Egyptian exile with the knowledge and experience of Weimar's destruction. With regard to both history and racial identity, although Levy-Lenz does not ignore the topic of Jewish difference entirely, he does not portray it as central to his own sense of self, and he certainly does not portray it as central to his practice of a certain type of medicine. He does not use race to depict himself or other German Jews as oppressed or marginalized others. The stereotypes, so there are stereotypes that surface, however, and it's not that Jewishness is not thematized. So the stereotype that surfaces several times in his memoirs is that of Jews as rootless urbanites. But this is given a positive secular humanist spin. For Levy-Lenz, to be an exile is to be cosmopolitan in its most positive sense. So I know that cosmopolitanism was also used as a critique within National Socialist culture against the Jews, so I'm aware of that. But Levy-Lenz says it makes, when all men are expatriates, they are, quote, brothers of all men, citizens of the world, end quote. And he says someday we'll all be expatriates and we'll all be brothers of all men, citizens of the world. So that's his vision. The view from exile in Cairo, which was teeming with expatriates in the 1930s and 40s, is one that provides a stark contrast to the National Socialist regime of racial purity. Indeed, the Egyptian city becomes the model for diversity and peaceful coexistence. Levy-Lenz writes, quote, "In Cairo, that beautiful town on the Nile, I was astonished when I saw all the different races living there, especially when I noticed how peacefully those people of different races, characteristics, religions, and colors were living side by side. I do not think that there is a second country in the world where such tolerance can be found," end quote. It is in statements such as these that race plays a role in Levy-Lenz's memoirs. He was a strong advocate of what he calls racial mixing, but not because, as Gilman implies by mentioning Levy-Lenz's own mixed marriage, not because he saw it as a path toward assimilation, as a way for Jews to become less visible by intermarrying with Gentiles, but rather actually as a path forward and a path towards human progress. And just to set the record straight, Levy-Lenz was married 3 times. This is something that Tina Grossman also mentions in Reforming Sex, because she says, who's he to talk about marital boredom and give tips about marital boredom when he kept changing wives. But his first marriage was to a non-Jew. So this is presented in Gilman as evidence of Levy-Lenz being for intermarriage, was the fact that he married a non-Jewish woman. But he did so. This was his first marriage was to a non-Jew. And Levy-Lenz does describe how difficult it was actually to convince his own mother that he could marry this non-Jewish woman, and that his non-Jewish wife converted to Judaism in order to please Levy-Lenz's conservative mother, and leads him to then launch into a diatribe about nationalistic people, where he's actually talking about his mother's own prejudice against his non-Jewish wife, and he says that all nationalistic people are prejudiced people, and this is the bad path to go down. And so there's all kinds of things. The way he uses his marriage to talk about other issues is very interesting, and we'll see that at the end. Racial mixing, as it is portrayed in Levy-Lenz's book, offers an alternative vision of human progress and ultimately of superiority that counters the racist regime of the National Socialists, while still, and this is a key point, while still preserving the integrity of eugenics and its central premise that only good stock should reproduce. Intermarriage is, according to Levy-Lenz, what pushed humankind into the modern age. It was what allowed modern Europe to achieve greatness, and as we see in his description of Cairo, it's the most productive direction for humankind to pursue, although the language in the quote about Cairo is interesting in that he talks about people living side by side, not necessarily intermixing. So the question that I would have is it about mixing or is it about peaceful coexistence? The place of exile hence takes on the promise that Europe once held. Consider, please, the following 2 quotes from Levy-Lenz's memoirs, which I think best illustrate his view of racial mixing as the driver of human progress and his desire to cling to the hope for continued progress. What determines good stock is defined less by physical health, as the National Socialists would have had it, and racial purity, etc., than by intellectual prowess. The superior human is the one with the enlightened mind, free from ideas of racial purity. So here's the first quote about how Europe achieved greatness, modern Europe achieved greatness through racial mixing. So he's referring in this part of the book to the Renaissance and says, quote, "To what cause the sudden mental revolution is to be attributed, we do not know. I am of the opinion, however, that it was due partly to a successful racial mixture. The great tribal and racial migrations which had taken place 1,000 years earlier had so leavened the peoples of Europe that a new race had been generated, modern man." And the second quote, and you get a little extra of the quote in there. "There is no pure Aryan, pure Nordic, pure Jewish race. There are only human beings with good or bad mixed blood. The bad mixture is revealed by stupidity. The good by what is known as a mature mind. A mature mind belongs to a human being who is free of personal and national egoism, who loves freedom and progress, a human being who is a friend of the arts and science, and who carries out with love and tolerance his duty in his everyday life. As tempting as the idea of a post-racial society filled with enlightened friends of the arts and sciences may be, I say with tongue in cheek, the latter vision still relies on a form of reproductive engineering and an elite that decides what constitutes bad versus good mixed blood. Indeed, I was struck by reading the memoirs by how vehemently Levy-Lenz still supported negative eugenic measures like sterilization and population control, despite historical events he had observed and experienced. He was, as Atina Grossman notes in Reforming Sex, not the only Weimar sex reformer who struggled in the 1950s with the fact that ideas that they had seen as socially progressive were hijacked by the Nazis and used for nefarious purposes, to say the least. I was also struck by Levy-Lenz's warnings against cross-cultural marriages, which reveal a tenacious Eurocentricity. So he's for racial mixing, but listen to this. Quote, "I applaud a match such as that between a Chinese woman brought up in Europe from the time of her birth and a European. But I would advise against marriage between a European and a Chinese woman who had grown up in China. Their backgrounds would be too different," end quote. And he really then goes on to stress, the person from another culture coming to Europe must be born in Europe in order, because the first years, the early childhood years are much too formative. And so that's one example. Praise for Cairo aside, Levy-Lenz's worldview still reveals an image of Europe as civilized and Asia and Africa as primitive. And his advice regarding sterilization, population control, and intermarriage reveal an impulse to control and shape human reproduction, to manipulate and define what progress is. Still, by changing the terms of reproductive fitness in a way that departs from the physical and stresses the intellectual, Levy-Lenz's writings on race cannot convincingly be connected to a discourse of passing that is enabled by cosmetic surgery, as Gilman would have it. So you've probably noticed that one of the central aims of my talk is to decouple race in Levy-Lenz's memoirs from gender, so that one issue is not subsumed by the other. And in the discussion of cosmetic surgery, I would contend that gender is just as important, if not, and my opinion is that it's even more important than race. Now, before I launch into the final section of my paper, I want to make my point very clear, and please pardon my double negative. I am not saying that racial conformity is not one of the motivating factors behind cosmetic surgery in general. What I am saying is that in the case of the sexologist turned cosmetic surgeon Levy-Lenz, and in the intersections between sexual reassignment surgery and cosmetic surgery that so shaped his career, or at least he claims, gender is the central dynamic, and the gender dynamics at work are sometimes rather troubling. So, final section, the Pygmalion complex and the cosmetic gaze. Sorry, I keep banging this. Like Levy-Lenz does in his memoirs, I'm going to begin with a biographical anecdote and connect it to a larger paradigm within sexology and cosmetic surgery. And hey, if his marriages were fair game for Sandra Gilman, then what the heck? Here we go. When discussing his first two marriages and analyzing the possible reasons for their end, Levy-Lenz begins by likening himself to Pygmalion, claiming, quote, "I too have a certain desire to create, to form, to educate, to build," end quote. And now I will launch into a longer quote in terms of how he explains what we already have some shaking heads if you're starting to read. "It was the same with Diana and with Elma. I met both of them when they were young and immature. I educated them and they became cultured and worthy women. That such a result was only possible because the material was good goes without saying." And here's also self-aggrandizement, right? I picked great material. "It had happened that I was fortunate in my choice, in the choice of my material. But when I had before me the perfect woman, when instead of asking questions, they gave me my own answers, and instead of hesitation, I heard my own thought, I was bored and satiated. My work was completed, I could leave the stage. The work gave me untold joy, such joy, indeed, that to this day I'm still thankful to the marble." Yes, I shrieked, actually. In the archive, I shrieked, yeah. "The statue may now provide joy for others." While I'm analyzing, and remember he did study psychiatry, so he's analyzing himself here. "I may as well mention a characteristic which both of my wives had in common, or rather, which slowly crystallized in each of them. They became too independent, too masculine. I do not like to have an independent woman for my wife. A woman who works autocratically, makes her own decisions, gives her own orders in restaurants, acts on her own, may well be the object of my admiration, but never of my love." End quote. "I have hardly read a more striking example of the valorization of men as educators and artists, creators indeed, and the reduction of women to mere material waiting to be shaped. Racial mixing may be depicted in Levy-Lenz's memoirs as essential to human progress, but gender mixing, or the blurring of gender boundaries this passage implies, is another matter entirely. By shaping his wives to fit his own likeness, especially intellectually, he wound up with women who were, quote unquote, too masculine, and thereby no longer desirable, no longer worthy of his love. His third wife, Mary, was the only one he got to shape physically, for he fell in love with her while repairing facial lacerations she had sustained during a car accident. One conclusion we could draw from Levy-Lenz's self-description, as well as his career trajectory, is that the cosmetic surgeon and sexologist's preferred type of shaping is that which reifies traditional femininity. It's the shaping of vagina and labia, of symmetrical breasts and hairless bodies that help transsexuals to become what they desired to become. And this is what Reiner quotes in his own book, they wanted to become real women. And Herrn rightly calls for further research into why sexual intermediates might find the traditional 19th century form of femininity so desirable. Certainly in Levy-Lenz's Memoirs of a Sexologist, the utterly feminine woman, these are his words, and the completely masculine man are still depicted as opposite ends of the gender spectrum, even as ideals. He sometimes talks about percentages. The 100% woman is like this, and the 100% man is like this. By asserting, as he does later in life in a medical pamphlet on cosmetic surgery, published in 1960, that cosmetic surgery, quote, and this is Levy-Lenz, unlike all other medical specializations, requires a clear artistic sense for form, end quote. And by admitting that most of his patients are women, and he says women who want peace and self-confidence, Levy-Lenz implies that the task of envisioning and defining feminine beauty remains the domain of men. If we consider the fact that in the 21st century United States, 91% of all cosmetic procedures are performed on women, and 8 out of 9 cosmetic surgeons are male, and that an oft-cited claim made by those male surgeons is that they are artists as much as they are doctors, we can see how the central idea of gender and the Pygmalion we can see how central the idea of gender and this Pygmalion complex are to the phenomenon of cosmetic surgery, and how the image of creative, penetrating masculinity is paired with that of soft, pliable femininity. In her provocative book, The Cosmetic Gaze, Body Modification and the Construction of Beauty from 2012, Bernadette Wegenstein traces what she calls, quote, the cosmetic gaze, of course, that's the title of her book, from the late 18th century physiognomic drawings of Johann Caspar Lavater through the 19th century works of Charles Darwin and Francis Galton, whom you know coined the term eugenics, through Nazi race science to contemporary makeover shows on reality television. What Wegenstein leaves out of this historical trajectory, quite curiously, in my opinion, is any mention of some of the first cosmetic surgeons like Ludwig Levy-Lenz. His memoirs, after all, provide rich material, I guess that's the best way of putting it, rich material for exploring the many facets of the cosmetic gaze, from its perpetuation of the misogynistic fantasy of the woman as a blank surface, receptive to man's creative urge, which is clearly at work in this description, and his admission of his own Pygmalion complex, to the cosmetic gaze's transformational possibilities and the complex relationship it constitutes between patients, surgeons, and modern visual media, such as film and the cosmetic industry and any attending advertisements or visual media that the cosmetics industry uses. All of these things actually do come up in Levy-Lenz's writings on sexual reassignment surgery and on cosmetic surgery in general. Indeed, he does display a keen awareness of the power of film, the cult of Hollywood stars, and the illustrated press, and the formative role that such visual media played in the rise of cosmetic surgery. So even in this later pamphlet from 1960, he talks about, why did cosmetic surgery rise into, become a popular practice. And he says one reason is World War I and the reparation of war wounds, and the other is the rise of film and visual media. So he has some interesting points to make there. Now back to Wegenstein for a second, and I'm in closing. Unwilling to strip cosmetic surgery patients of their agency completely, no matter what their gender, Wegenstein explores the ways that media images, patients' desires for change, and surgeons' visions, as well as their mastery of medical technologies, play off of one another and entwine with one another in order to construct the cosmetic gaze, which she defines thus. The cosmetic gaze refers to how humans experience their own and others' bodies as incomplete projects that await the intervention of technologies of enhancement, which will help them better approximate their true self or natural potential. If we return for a moment to the quote from Levy-Lenz's memoirs I displayed earlier, so the one where he talks about his experiments, and here again we see people as material, we can talk about that. So if we return to this quote, we see how, at least from Levy-Lenz's perspective, the vision for self-improvement comes from the patients and their desires to appear more masculine or feminine. Their vision of what is meant to be masculine or feminine may have come from the sexological writings of Levy-Lenz and his colleagues at the Institute, or it may have come from other cultural texts or visual media, or a combination of the two and all three mixed together. We cannot know, can really only speculate. It was the surgeon's role at this point in time to take the medical knowledge and technologies at his disposal and to experiment, as he says. In fact, I would argue that this quote contains both the hope and the danger of cosmetic surgical intervention, for by admitting that he cut into his patients without knowing what the outcome might be, Levy-Lenz articulates the hope that, out of controlled destruction, beauty can be created, a beauty that can allow patients to feel more at home in their own skin and to accept themselves. But it also acknowledges that the construction of beauty can be perilous, and that the relentless pursuit of physical beauty can result in something monstrous and destructive as well. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your talk. So it was very, very interesting. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about these operations that he performed, and I'm wondering if what he thought about homosexuality, Did he ever perform any operations on homosexuals?
There's fairly little evidence, as I said. So some of the evidence out there, let me just turn to one thing that I did find that contended that there were some there were people who came to the Cairo clinic to have sexual reassignment surgery from him. So one in particular was an Austrian performer, I'm forgetting the name right now, who then did change from male to female and was rather popular in the post-war era. So that there's a web page that claims that this particular performer was operated on by Levy-Lenz in Cairo, and then even that the clinic existed after his death and continued to operate on people. So, but again, I don't necessarily consider the sources that I found to be authoritative, and therefore I would say that there's very little evidence of his surgical practices, except that he wrote manuals and how-tos for all kinds of aesthetic surgeries. But in terms of the sexual reassignment surgery, there's little to no concrete evidence of those out there. So that I don't necessarily feel comfortable contending that he worked broadly in that field. And, you know, I mean, he basically always, when he speaks about his patients, he speaks about restoring, and he always says, he does say restoring, like wiedergeben, their self-confidence, as if it was somehow lost at some point, and that they needed to be returned, and through these physical transformations that they desire, he helps them to restore, he often says, peace and self-confidence. And yeah, so the later works that I read in the archive about cosmetic surgery were mostly about very particular procedures, so how, you know, what kind of things were in fashion at the time, that actually breast reduction was more in fashion when he was working rather than breast enhancement, and how to do the best job at that, and how, I mean, certain, really, they were meant for a medical audience concerned with trying out some of these procedures. Yes, you have a follow-up question.
I'm thinking about some endocrinological works in the 30s. You have eugenicists that wanted to treat homosexuals. Does Levy-Lenz say anything about these medical theories?
Right, about Steinach and some of these things. I mean, he mentions, he does mention Steinach several times and in several contexts. One is the rejuvenation process, and he does mention hormonal therapy, I think briefly, but it's not something that he speaks about a lot. Rainer, you're looking very, right, I think Rainer's going to help me out here. But he does say that, I mean, he is accepting of people, of sexual intermediates. So he does say, you know, if you are, you know, he says that if I had gotten to stay in Weimar, Berlin, I would have opened a clinic for people who have very different desires than the mainstream, and I would have tried to find the perfect match for them. I would have tried to find people with non-normative sexual behaviors who matched with each other. So he does have extensive conversation or extensive discussions in these memoirs. As I said, you'll find almost anything in here about various fetishes, etc., and homosexuality is thematized, lesbianism is thematized, and he says, you know, these are more masculine women, but there's no judgment necessarily in the negative. Just for his own self, that would not be something desirable. Okay, right, I have lots of, yeah.
Maybe I can add a
Yeah.
little bit. Levy-Lenz was very closely tied to the Steinach idea of endocrinological influencing of sexuality. And he has, at the same time, it was one of the most popular rejuvenation clinics in Berlin. He worked together with Peter Schmidt, who exiled to China and reopened there and rejuvenation clinic. And in 1926, maybe it's really unknown, the UFA made a film in the clinic of Levy-Lenz, where he was transplanting testicles of a rhesus ape to a human. And it's published in Die medizinische Welt of 1926, when I'm right.
Yeah.
And I think that is another level of binding together sexology and aesthetic chirurgy. Because Levy-Lenz published a book, Janine, A Diary of a Rejuvenated. And so the idea of rejuvenation was to give a potency to the man back, because it was...
Right, like Viagra kind of thing. I mean, right, yeah. No, but that's true. The film is obviously, one cannot find anything about the film. Obviously, the film was destroyed because all I could find in my research for this was the mention of the film. So thank you for jogging my memory. And of course, he does talk extensively about Peter Schmidt and how that became Peter's field, was that that Levy-Lenz sort of dabbled in rejuvenation, but Peter Schmidt then took over the field of rejuvenation. But he does certainly mention Steinach and the work that Steinach was doing, and that he was aware of it, and he found it very interesting. And nice.
I have to confess that before today I had no idea about this person, and so to prepare, I was looking in the internet. I found a Wikipedia.
Yeah.
But there were two strange things. I mean, one story was I read there that he somehow planned, I think in 1935, to return to Germany.
He did return.
Which somehow is strange, because according to what I do know is that Jewish physicians were not permitted to have medical offices, and if at all, only to treat Jewish persons. So do we know anything about what he thought? And the other thing is, you mentioned at the beginning that he somehow was in World War II in Cairo, so just few kilometers west of Cairo. I mean, there was a battle of El Alamein, and if Marshal Montgomery wouldn't have beaten Rommel, I mean, all of this rest of a progressive Weimar culture would have been destroyed as well. I mean, is there anything of this in his memoirs?
No, there's nothing about Rommel. Actually, in the Aufbau article, there's a mention of Rommel. So this Hansi Strauss, who I quoted as saying, he makes great gefilte fish, said that she met Levy-Lenz and his wife in a detention camp basically, she says, auf der Flucht, so fleeing from Rommel. And so they were in Alexandria at that point, so they did have to move around. That's why I said that the clinic, the work that he did was interrupted because of the war. So he was then clearly peripatetic within Egypt for a while because of Roma. And then in terms of his thinking, the only thing I could find about why he returned, there's nothing in the memoirs actually about the return to Germany in the third. So he went to Paris briefly. So he left in 1933, he went to Paris, and then he came back. And the source material, again, some of it's authoritative and some of it isn't, so that I usually look at the Institute or the Magnus Hirschfeld Gesellschaft and then at the Hebele archive, and both of those say that he was lulled into thinking that because of some of the relaxation of laws, anti-Jewish laws around the period of the 1936 Olympics, that would actually mean that these laws were going to be repealed or that they would remain relaxed, and he opened up a practice on the Kurfürstendamm for mostly, I think, cosmetic surgery patients.
For how long?
He left in 1937 for Cairo. Yeah, so he really only lasted 1 year, and then his citizenship was revoked by the Nazis in 1939. Yeah, okay.
Very interesting talk. Thank you very much. Just a brief statement. I have two quick questions. Cosmetic surgery was enormously popular in East Asia, particularly in Japan, early in the 20th century, primarily eyes and nose. It was, after the war, particularly in the occupation, it came to be associated with racial concepts of beauty, although generally speaking, it was really more to I don't know how to put this, normative eyes, the way that people look. Their eyes had the double fold, and there was a significant minority who did not have that, and so there was a tendency to want that, and again it becomes associated with racial stereotyping and racial notions of beauty fairly early on, particularly in the occupation period. I'm just mentioning that at the beginning because I'm wondering, the two questions I had for while he was in Cairo, where did his clientele come from mainly? Did he have much contact in Asia? You just mentioned that there was in China this early clinic. And more importantly, were his writings, particularly his surgical notes, did that circulate very widely? Did he have contacts in Asia? I mean, thinking mainly of Japan, but in China as well.
I haven't found any evidence of contacts in Asia. There is, and again, in some of the archive materials I saw, there's a fair amount of information about the fact that one of his first patients in Egypt was Khatun, the famous folk singer, that she got a breast reduction from him, and that there's a lot of, that's pretty much the only famous patient who's documented as having been operated on by him, and in terms of the surgical writings, I mean, clearly he was also then trying to bridge. He worked he did some editing work for various medical journals in English, and then of course he founded this journal for sexology and cosmetic surgery, and then and I think Rainer and I were talking about this right before my talk, trying to reestablish this link of sexology and cosmetic surgery back into Germany, and have it be produced in Berlin, etc. But I think it's quite telling that he established his other clinic, his German-based clinic in Baden-Baden, which is, of course, the casino, right? I mean, this is all for people who want to go to spa and go to the casino and really the elegant world, right? The magician of the fashionable world. And
So
really
his
fits.
clientele, though, would have been either the economic elite or people simply, like, from the U.S. who wouldn't have been able to get sex.
Yeah, that is my sense. And you're chomping at the bit over here to say something
Just
about
to
that.
clarify what Dennis is asking, so there's a high rate of female genital mutilation in Egypt, and some of the surgeries that doctors are asked to perform have to do with clitoridectomy or restoration of hymen. You find no evidence that he discusses that?
Restoration of a hymen, I do.
Restoration of
Yeah.
hymen. So,
Yeah,
but
he
not
does
clitoridectomy.
talk
Does
about
he
that.
talk about any of the female patients and their genitalia? There was recently a report from the World Health Organization that doctors in Egypt were looking for normal genitalia to know what actually is normal, because all the women patients have been cut. So you find he doesn't discuss it, he's not entirely oblivious to it as an issue. I think that's a theme you might want to pursue, how someone can be oblivious who is a sexologist.
Right, I mean, there's really so little, that's my irritation, especially due to my own title, is that there's very little out there about his time in Cairo. So you have some of these works that he produced about cosmetic surgery, but in terms of records that I could find, at least in Berlin where I was looking, I would love to go to Cairo, but I didn't have time this summer to go in advance of this talk, but certainly. I know there are documents evidently in the archives about how who was at his villa during the 50s and 60s when, during the Suez Crisis, things that I mentioned when he was, the Villa Heidelberg is mentioned as a place where people went. But otherwise, in terms of documents of the Cairo clinic and patients, I have found nothing.
So he excises that.
Yeah, or there's nothing.
Yeah, I had a question that goes in that similar direction. Namely, is there any record of how the culture of Cairo or Egypt or Arabic culture had any impact on his thinking? And we do know that German Jewish exiles who came to this country, not just social scientists and artists, but also scientists, were profoundly shaped by the experience of the United States. But is Cairo just a peaceful, tolerant place, and he remains his Eurocentric self, or is there any? Can you find any traces in which the sort of Arabic culture begins to permeate his work, and his thinking starts to change, that kind of thing?
Nothing. Really, the only later writings I could find after the memoirs, and as I say, I mean the one evidence of Cairo. Actually, I gave you both of the only two pieces of evidence that he was even in Cairo when he wrote the memoirs were these two quotes I gave you, so that it was saying written in the winter of our distress, 1941 in Cairo. and then his praise for Cairo as this tolerant, diverse society. And otherwise, I looked through, it will list that he's in Cairo when he's doing this work, and otherwise no reflective. I tried very hard at the Hebele archive to get to some of his unpublished writings, because he did also he tried to write novels with patients as inspiration, or this Janine, right? I mean, so I tried, and there's protected material there that they can't show me. So that's where I think there also might be some writings about patients that we cannot access. I couldn't access at this time, or I was told I couldn't access. So I'm irritated by that, because I think then there might be some evidence about patients in some of those works.
Yeah, I just got my antennas up when you said unpublished writings that are not accessible right now. I was wondering, that which is accessible, the memoir, for example, what do we know about the audience for which this memoir was written? Because I was so struck by the title. I mean, it sounds promising, Memoirs of Sexologist Discretion and Indiscretion. And is this a genre, or an established genre, memoirs of a groundbreaking doctor, to put it naively, or and to which degree do you have to factor that into your evaluation of this memoir as a source? Yeah.
I mean, right, that's why I tried to emphasize at the outset that it's this sort of bizarre, very entertaining mixed genre of autobiographical writing. But then the way he weaves these test cases in there and says, this is a person I treated, this is what I did, these were my mentors, but these were the things that I shaped. I mean, it is very, grab Reiner's word, very gossipy in a lot of ways, and certainly must be critically interrogated. I think it probably had an audience with people in the United States who might have been followers of Kinsey. So I think that would be my first answer, is that those, because it was published first here and in the UK, that those who were still around in terms of, or those who may have followed the works of Ellis, et cetera, in Great Britain may have been interested in it, and those who were interested in the Kinsey reports may have found this fascinating. I mean, the marketing materials say, he's cited in all of the sexological texts in the world. There's all this aggrandizing language that I wonder if it came from Levy-Lenz himself, right? I would be suspicious. But in terms of whether I can compare it to other works, I mean, he has a certain tone in a lot of, I recognized his tone from some of his earlier writings, even in some of the Hirschfeld's collections, right, from the moral histories. This very chatty, very worldly, anecdotal, entertaining, informative, all mixed together so that you can be lulled into thinking, this person is a great authority, et cetera. So, yeah, that's something to contemplate, and certainly in the longer version of this, I want to do more with the genre. In terms of finding out reception history, that's of course hard and not necessarily but I did wonder about that as well as I was writing this. Yeah.
I wanted just to make a technical suggestion, and that is that it's far from out of the question that materials from the clinic are still available in Cairo. Going in the summer would not be the best thing to do, but it's and I think 3 months might be a bit. But there are 2 or 3 different avenues, one of which simply is to follow up the physical property of the clinic. And I was telling somebody on the way over, my recollection is that I saw that very sign in Cairo. Still, is it on? I don't know if it was in Gezira. Is that? Do you know where the office is?
Anticana Street.
Oh, Anticana. Okay.
So okay. That's where the clinic is.
So I could have seen it there as well. Yeah. So that's one of the main streets that goes from the museum to the old center of town. But the second thing I was going to say is that almost certainly I should think you'd find not just people who are associated with practice, but also sexology is a real field in Cairo. You still see signs and so on and so forth. And it wouldn't be surprising if you had disciples who could either guide you to surviving documentation, assuming the clinic is closed, or at least memories of his time there. So there'd be a lot of informal research rather than institutional research. But I think that it could be, assuming you find him worth the time, it could be a lot of really interesting material that you could have there for exile culture, for, of course, cosmetic surgery, Egyptian society in the 40s and 50s, and
I was
and
really
some of
hoping that
Susanna's questions as well, perhaps.
I don't know if any of you know this, that there's a documentary film that has been made called Jews of Egypt that focuses on Jews in exile in Cairo in the 30s and 40s. And the release keeps getting delayed by the censor in Egypt. So I keep waiting. It was supposed to be released in the spring, I think actually last fall already, and then this spring, and then it keeps getting delayed. And because my inkling is that there might be something in there about Levy-Lenz, but certainly following the physical trail would be intriguing. I don't know if, as you say, if that is worth my time, but maybe actually putting a little bit more pressure on the archive in Berlin to see some of these files. I don't know if that will work. I tried twice. So, and I don't think I'll get to Cairo before September, before the volume is due. But certainly, it's something that's helpful. Yeah.
How does he get to go to Cairo? What is the connection? I mean, and I think you kind of partly answered that question. I mean, how does Levy-Lenz end up in Cairo? What is the connection? And it seems there is a Jewish presence during the war there. I'm not aware of the connection and the history behind it.
That's also, I mean, really that this was an expatriate community that interested him. There's also really no writings about that particular motivation. I don't know if there's anyone else in this room who knows more about that particular area that might be able to help out here, but he certainly doesn't say anything. It's sort of this all of a sudden he's in Cairo and practicing, and I don't know if there were leads already from, my sense from reading his writings is that he had contacts, at least how he presents it, all over the world, and may have had a sense of where his work would be well received. And so if there is, and was already an Egyptian following for sexology, then that might have been indicative of a good place to call home or open up this practice. And apparently Khatun went to him right away in the late 30s, and he operated on her then. So I think through connections to higher society within North Africa is my sense from what I've read. But in terms of a concrete reason, I can't give it at this point. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. So I really appreciated a lot about your critique of Gilman, but I wondered if perhaps in situating your argument in relation to his in that way, you reversed his analytic priorities and missed a chance to think about racialized gender. And I guess I wanted to point to a couple of resources for thinking about that, because the source material seems really rich in that way. But my question was, have you thought about this, about the ways that that these sex change operations depend on racialized constructions of beauty? Like the binary that you talk about is a European, it's not extreme masculinity and extreme femininity. It's masculinity and femininity based on a European, set of gender ideals. There are more masculine and more feminine, sort of bodies in this racialized gendered schema at the moment, but they're not imagined as complementary, dimorphic populations. Sally Markowitz's work on race and sexual dimorphism, I was thinking.
Yeah, of course I had. I mean, that's why I also said that I know that that clearly race does play a role. What I wanted to show is that that there's no evidence of that in Levy-Lenz in terms of. I mean, there's evidence of this Eurocentricity and certain beauty ideals, but there is not, for me, a discourse of race that determines the desire for cosmetic surgery. So I think, I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, I have thought about it. There's certainly a lot in Wagenstein's book about the cosmetic gaze, about how race and gender do intertwine. And certainly, I think that's a productive direction to go in. Do you have any other sources? Because this is clearly also a project in the making, so I'm happy.
Actually, about what you said about if you took Gilman's reading back to this version of the text, then to want to look like a man would be to want to look like a Jewish man, and that sounded kind of funny. But then I was thinking of Donna Troca's work on race and drag king culture, and the ways in which racialized signs to express masculinity are deployed all the time, right? So maybe to look more Jewish, not explicitly, but to look more Jewish would be to look more masculine. So I think the interplay of those
that's
things.
fascinating. Whereas Gilman almost always, and I'm thinking about Daniel Boyarin, of course, talking about actually to look more Jewish is usually to be perceived as feminized, right? So that would be actually a very interesting argument to make, to say that actually a Jewish ideal, a Jewish masculine ideal might be at work here. So that would of course be fascinating. Considering that in terms of the literature on gender and Jewishness in particular, that there's usually talk of a feminized Jewish male. So.
All right, it's a total question. What precisely did he return to Germany?
Well,
and did he apply again for a German citizenship? Did he maybe even apply for reparation paying, since he really was robbed of, in Berlin in the 30s? And then it would be a question to Rainer as well. I hardly can imagine that there was in early West Germany in the early 50s sexology. This came in the 60s with Oswald Koller and so on. But
right.
In the early 50s, no sexology over there.
Well, that's why it dropped. I mean, that's what Rainer and I were talking about right before the talk, is that clearly this was a dead issue for people. This was not a way to market this journal, and that it went through several issues in that first year, and then by 1953, Sexology was out of the title. And in terms of asking for reparation payments, I don't know the answer for that. I know that he commuted, so Cairo remained his main place of residence, and then he had a practice in Baden-Baden. But he died in Munich, which I find fascinating, and there's nothing that I could find as to why he was in Munich, whether he was then just there because he was ill and was in a clinic in Munich. But
it might make sense to look at the reparation archives.
Yeah.
Whether there is a thing of his.
Go ahead.
He was so clever that his third wife got all his belongings when he exiled, and that was a trick. And to sexology in Germany, it was found in the 50s. Hans Giese and Hans Bürgerprinz, psychiatrists, tried to trace a very different line, not the Hirschfeld line. Hirschfeld was a no-go in Germany, but Levy-Lenz tried to pick up the trace of Hirschfeld, and that was the wrong direction in Germany, because it was this sexual, reformic, liberal ideas that were not appreciated. It has to do with being in laws, the Nazi paragraphs, for instance, for persecution of homosexuals. So it was not acknowledged as Nazi laws, and it depends in that context.
Right, but
So which year was it the first time he came back?
that he came back
Is it
in the
written in biography?
50s. It's not, because the biography was, I mean, this was published in the early 50s, so the memoir was written in 41 and then revised in 49, and then he was still in Cairo. And the source material mentions, I think, in the 50s, mid-50s, that he came back.
I think 52 or 53.
Yeah. So that would make sense with this journal, probably at the same time as the journal.
Yes.
Yeah.
Last question, then I finish. Do we know
Yeah.
what kind of a publication society published the German issue
Of
his
the
memoir?
memoirs, yes. So it was in Baden-Baden, Wadi Verlag.
There are 3 editions in Germany.
Uh-huh.
The first one, I think, is that you mentioned, and there are 2 also, I would say, in a grey market. They came later on, and they even were sold till the 60s.
What about?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Thank you very much for your fascinating talk. I have a couple of questions. One is, I'm really fascinated by the connection of sexology to cosmetic surgery and the different terms for it, whether it's aesthetic surgery, is it plastic surgery, is it cosmetic surgery? And I'm wondering, it sounded like at the beginning of your talk, Levy-Lenz identifies himself as a sexologist and as a humanitarian, and I'm wondering, where does the humanitarianism translate into the cosmetic surgeon identity? Because I'm really interested as well in the question of, like, who is the driving force in the operating room? Is it the patient desire? Is it the doctor's desire? And I think, to a certain extent, with this quote here, that Levy-Lenz has to be taken at face value, that he's doing an experiment. And that to this extent, I'm interested to know if he also wrote on or was interested in cases of ambiguous sex or hermaphroditism, where it might not be a case where it's someone who wants to make some sort of aesthetic change, but it's actually about sex determination and the role of surgery there. Because in my own research, I've encountered those types of cases, and it's definitely an experimental mode where the doctor can sort of uses the patient desire for normality or change as a kind of carte blanche for experimenting and seeing what happens. And I'm wondering there to the role of cosmetic surgery in either elaborating or reifying notions of sexual difference.
So let me go back to your first question, where does the humanitarian aspect come in? And that's very clear that he writes over and over again that the physician's job is to help fellow humans realize their best selves, basically, right? So that comes up again and again, that he learned this in Heidelberg, that to be a doctor is to be a humanitarian. I think that also is something I would interpret it as a way of looking back to the National Socialist era and saying doctors are good, we are not necessarily in the world to do ill and just to work within some sort of regime as was the case in the Nazi era. So he, I think, has to also re-legitimize the position of the physician and then, of course, create a legitimate position for himself as a cosmetic surgeon. And that is a little bit harder. So he does talk, I was particularly fascinated by this 1960s pamphlet about aesthetic surgery and about how cross-disciplinary it is, that it has to do with dermatology, that it has to do with ear, nose, throat, that it has to do with jaw operation, that there's a lot of work that he puts into legitimizing his own position as a cosmetic surgeon. In terms of sexual difference, I mean, I think, again, there's this strain of, or this balance he tries to strike between acceptance and also, he does almost always, when he's not portraying himself as this artist with this great vision, right, of what beauty is supposed to be, that's usually in relation to gender. in cases, I don't think he specifically mentions hermaphrodism as a experimental phase, but Reiner, you can correct me on this, or something that he particularly worked with. But his main goal, as he states it, is usually to help the patient to find themselves through this physical alteration. I mean, there is, again, that connection, as I said in my paper, between the physical and the psychic that he is constantly trying to connect. So this idea of betterment, and that's why I found Wegenstein's work so helpful in my conceptualization of this paper, because she talks about the cosmetic gaze being a moralizing gaze, because it can, from the patient's perspective as well, help to discover and create then a better self. And so I would recommend, her work if you haven't looked at it, because it works with, she does pretty adeptly negotiate gender, sexuality, and race. So, Veronica, yeah.
I had a question also. I felt that there was also a story in your paper about how the position of medical authority is racialized. And insofar as we have the Clinique de Berlin, right? So it's Berlin, sexology as a practice in Berlin. We have the Villa Heidelberg, right? So we have this space constructed as a Germanic space. And then you mentioned the advertising for the book, for the memoirs. He's described as a magician, and he's described as an oracle.
The great oracle.
So there is a great oracle. So there seems to be an orientalization of his position of medical authority. So for the readership, I think in some ways Egypt is transported through that. I think that's the intention. And I'm wondering if there's more of the story in some of the sources that you looked at. You just mentioned the publisher Wadi Verlag. I mean, is that connected to kind of orientalizing language that is used then after the war in this context? So how does this position of medical authority that is construed change in its racial connotations?
Okay, hold on, let's see. Yeah, I mean, I think, right, I mean, the question of how the Wadi Verlag and this marketing of the materials is then orientalized, really, right? So he becomes sort of after, sorry. Yeah, fascinating, and especially because Cairo is explicitly mentioned in that description of him as oracle. It says now he working between Cairo and Baden-Baden, and the publishing house is in Baden-Baden, and he's really promoted as coming from Cairo, the elegant world Orientalist. I think that's great. So there's almost a reverse flow of what we see with his imposition of European naming onto the landscape of his new, right, his home in exile, and then after this sort of orientalized story going on about what makes him so wonderful, and whether or not he's then behind this image of himself. And as I said, the quote about being a magician is his own, right? So he says, "Oh, people call me," right? So there's this false humility. People call me the magician of the elegant world, and there are often these turns of phrase similar to in this quote, right? A strange profession indeed, or a strange calling indeed, that I almost became a specialist. So oftentimes he portrays himself as having fallen into something but then mastering it, right? So there is this sense that, oh, then he became the great master of this, even though it was all really the impetus for this were these patients who had certain afflictions or certain desires that needed, and he helped them to realize this and then became this great magician. So I think I certainly was going to make an even bigger deal about the placing of the plate, the Clinique de Berlin, and the Villa Heidelberg, the Lenzburg, and his role as someone who shapes and crafts what it means to be a better self, etc. And So I think that's fascinating. I mean, I don't know exactly how, if you want more from me, but is
I
there?
don't have a complete theory on this either, but I think it tells something about the development of sexology and the way it is seen as scientific or not scientific at particular historical moments. And so what is the kind of investment that needs to be connected to that authority, sexological authority? And it seems to be that after the war there's a moment where it can become connected with magic, magical transformation, while before it can't. I don't know. I mean, that would be
before
my hunch, but I don't have it worked out.
Yeah, before it's all set. Okay, now we have several reactions to that.
I was actually just going to follow up on what Veronica was suggesting, is that how the Orient really does different kinds of work, works differently. One instance to kind of create the space that he's denied in Germany, and then how does it, become legitimizing when he goes back? It's kind of really interesting, and how it can do and is made to do different kinds of work. How it then becomes rather flexible and being deployed selectively to do kind of whatever it needs to be, whatever it needs to do at that particular moment. I think there's something there, and that's what I was suggesting through that questioning about what does Cairo mean? How does he, he's in Cairo. I mean, and he claims that space as Germanic. I think it's very interesting, and then goes back and then reclaims, and the Orient provides some kind of legitimacy, which is
especially if he can't claim the Hirschfeld legacy anymore, right? So if that piece of it has been delegitimized, then he has to retool himself, and that makes it right. Is that what you were going to say? Because you were also.
I think he used the authority of Hirschfeld just to define himself as his filiation.
Yeah, but then if that doesn't work, then he can find other ways to become, right? So he becomes the magician rather than the scientist, because I mean, Hirschfeld really does work as this. I mean, it seems like in Levy-Lenz's memoirs, Hirschfeld is the great master, right? And in terms of science and humanitarianism, right? So the scientific humanitarian committee, right? That's all, that vein is all Hirschfeld, and he pays homage to Hirschfeld over and over again. But then his own role then as magician, I find this narrative actually very fascinating. So hold on.
Did Levy-Lenz educate physicians in Cairo, and was there something like a sexology after Levy-Lenz in Cairo? And so outside developments and traces?
I don't know the second. I don't know an answer to the second one in terms of, but it seems to me that that's what you were getting at, that there's been an interest in sexology.
When I was an undergraduate, it was a weird thing. I'd never heard of such a thing, and I was walking around the streets of Cairo, this very area, on Antepani, and so on. There were lots of things that said, my favorite was gynecology, sexology, shortwave. Right, which sounded like some kind of radio thing, but X-rays.
Right.
But it was, there were lots of people, and in the big square where Gropey's is, there was a sexologist and so on. So there was certainly, the terminology was there.
Well then, I wouldn't be surprised if
in the early 70s.
Yeah, if he had a lot to do with that in terms of the X-ray, because when the X-rays were used sometimes for hair removal, etc. Right? That was, yep. So that could be the short wave for epilation. So I would not be surprised if he were involved. And yes, he does mention people coming to study with him in Cairo. So being a mentor for others. So not just having people come to the clinic to be operated upon, but also, he says, people have come to me to learn procedures. So absolutely, there's mention of that.
In the context that you just laid out, or that we reconstructed in the Q&A, I think then it makes perfect sense that the title is The Memoirs of a Sexologist, because then that clicks so nicely with this whole idea of self-refashioning as a magician, because the memoir, I think, is a popular genre, it's not a scientific genre, and it gives you a lot of leeway and a lot of licenses to dip into all kinds of texts in which you can continue this mode of revealing in a way, and of of telling bits and pieces, but maybe not the full story, as the magician does, right? So I wonder whether this is the last step in the process of self-fashioning, in a way of retooling his identity. I don't know whether you mentioned the German title, but if not, I'd be curious to.
It's the same.
It's the same. Okay,
Yeah.
so it's Memoiren or.
Memoiren eine Sexologie.
Right. So.
But the Diskretion und Indiskretes und Indiskretes. And it's interesting because that comes first. In the German title, the Diskretes and Indiskretes comes first. And then Memoiren und Sexologie, right? Oder Sexualarztes.
Ein Sexualarzt.
Sexualarztes, genau.
I think it's a little bit an analogy to the Weltkreis eine Sexualforschung Hirschfeld. So to take that term, sexologist, in the title is a certain attraction for the reader. So it's a promise.
But I think the memoir is also the perfect genre. If you want to reinvent yourself, then you have to do it through the memoir, because in the memoir you can cross the boundary from the scientific to the popular without too much trouble, because you can even be pseudoscientific in the memoir and bring in all kinds of materials that would not have a place in other kinds of genres of writing.
Right. No, he really does also, there are long passages where he takes on this very teacher-like tone and says, well, if you've never heard of this, let me explain what this is, let me explain what this particular fetish is and what the symptoms are of this and what I would then have advised or what I did advise in this case. So it really, he retains that position of authority, certainly, while guiding us through his life. And I mean, in terms of work that I've done with historians who work on memory, I approach this text with, suspiciously from the start, because the memoirs are almost always a refashioning of historical events that cannot be taken as facts. And so, but I hadn't really thought as much about the idea of the magician or about these Orientalist motifs that then come up in this refashioning. So that's fantastic.
Are there more questions? Otherwise, thank you very much to the talk.
Thank you for